Here I am at the gates of the Weißensee Jewish Cemetery in the Pankow district north of Berlin, where four of my ancestors are buried. Weißensee was the third Jewish cemetery in Berlin and the main
location for Jewish burials.
between about 1880 and through the Nazi era.
There are more than 100,000 graves at Weißensee, and it's said to be the second largest Jewish cemetery in Europe.
We'll go for a tour.
As we step inside, take
Careful note of the closing time, especially on a Friday, which is the beginning of the Sabbath. I failed to do that a week ago when I was here last Friday and found myself locked inside these gates, which was not a pretty experience. Here you have the view of the beautifully architected main cemetery building.
in front of the cemetery is a memorial to the victims of the Holocaust. We'll come back and take a closer look later.
This is the wall where I made my escape last week. It was a little hairy, I'll admit.
My grandmother, Ellie Ringel, visited Weißensee in the 1970s when it was in East Berlin. This is the map she kept and that was found among her papers. We'll use it in our search for the graves of Ellie's husband, Herman, and her parents, Isaac and Betty Volgemuth.
To get a feel of the cemetery, let's take a walk down section 1 in field S. The whole cemetery is covered with these dense trees. The graves are packed closely in, one upon the other. We'll be going soon to the two fields where my ancestors are buried and that I've previously located, but you can imagine, even when you're told what field to look in, how difficult it is to actually locate a particular grave. To give you an idea, here's section 07, which is where my grandfather is buried. I was here again last week, and even though I knew the row number that he was in, it still took me at least 40 minutes to find the correct grave. You can see there's very little in the way of walkways. You have to make your way through the ivy, stepping over some of the graves, and then you finally find the one you're looking for. And here is my grandfather's grave, Herman Ringel. He was buried here on the 24th of June, 1938, after he died suddenly of natural causes, just on the eve of his family's planned escape from Germany. After his death, my mother and her mother fled Berlin in October 1938, just before the Kristallnacht. This section, H5, is even more overgrown than where my grandfather is. This is where my great-grandfather and mother on the other side of the family are buried, and I had the location, but I despaired of actually finding the headstone because it was so thick. And then I suddenly came upon it. There it is. That's the one that's lit up in the sunlight. I'll get a little bit closer and give you some details about my Volgemuth family. Isaac was a merchant,
Did very well in business, first in Danzig and then after 1912 in Berlin. He served in German uniform during World War I. He died in 1929.
having lived right here in Weißensee, just about a mile away from the cemetery. His wife, Betty, survived him, and she lived all the way through the Nazi era until February of 1942. I wasn't sure when I came here whether I would find out that she might have taken her own life. The date you see there is very much in the middle of the deportation of the Jews from Berlin. She very likely would have received notice by now that she should be prepared for deportation. Other people of her age and class were deported to Theresienstadt in the months of May, June, and July of this year. So this was a few months before that. From the records that I've been able to access while here, that at the Centrum Judaicum, which is the which holds the records of the Jewish community, I learned that she, in fact, did not take her life, that she died of natural causes in February of 1942. The Jews of Berlin during this period were proud members of German society. They admired and participated in the arts, culture, the philosophy, the science that reached its heights here in the pre-World War II period. I believe you get a sense of those values by just observing these graves.
Okay, we're back now at the main cemetery building.
You can see by the clock that I'm doing much better today than I did last week. I don't think I'm going to be abandoned inside. And here, before we go, let's take a last look at the cemetery's Holocaust memorial. Um, all around the semicircle here are the names of the concentration camps that Jews perished in. I'll just show you a couple of them. Theresienstadt was the so-called good concentration camp, and that's where Betty Wolgemuth would have ended up if she had lived, although only for a short time before being sent on to Treblinka or Auschwitz or one of the other death camps. Here we have Sachsenhausen, that's the local Berlin area camp. Of course, Dachau, the one near Munich, and so on and so forth. One thing that I did learn about Betty Wolgemuth from this trip is that her burial here was arranged by a cousin of hers named Amelie Katz. And just 4 months after Amelie did the blessing to have Betty interred here, she was deported from Berlin. Amelie was first to Theresienstadt and then to her death at Treblinka.
So that concludes our visit to the Weißensee Jewish Cemetery in Berlin. Genealogy can be an emotional business, but also a deeply rewarding one. This is Dan Ruby on the road for Family Tree Magazine. Video captured by Iographer.